In this session, we're going to be talking about the risk assessment process. This is very important information because this is setting the stage for our understanding of how we actually complete an audit of the financial statements. The first thing that we need to understand is that we are considering things from the perspective of audit risk. Now, we talk about risk from a number of different perspectives. Audit risk is quite unique. Audit risk is the risk that the auditor has. And we'll talk about how the auditor has risks, but the official definition is that the risk that the auditor expresses an inappropriate audit opinion when in fact the financial statements are materially misstated. So in essence, what we're saying is that audit risk relates to the auditor issuing an inappropriate audit opinion. Now, one of the things that we need to understand is that the audit is a for-profit enterprise. We do not have unlimited time. We do not have unlimited resources to express an opinion. And on the client side, the client is quite imposed by the auditors being there and going through records, providing documentation, and all the things that the client needs to do. So the client wants the audit done. The auditor wants the audit done. But from the audit perspective is, even though we want to get the audit completed, the auditor needs to consider the fact that there will always be risk that what the opinion he or she is expressing is in fact inappropriate. And we're clearly concerned with expressing an unqualified opinion when in fact there are material misstatements embedded within the financial statements. Now, similar to our discussion that we had related to materiality, we consider audit risk from the perspective of the financial statements. We also are considering it from the assertion level. And if you remember, we talked about assertions earlier. Assertions are these statements implied or explicit within the financial statements that are the responsibility of management. We're also concerned with individual account balances as well as disclosures. The way we manage audit risk is through this audit risk model. Now, one of the great things about this model is it shows a relationship. And you notice that audit risk equals the product of three items: inherent risk times control risk times detection risk. So I'm not so much interested in quantifying these in terms of actual numbers, but what I'm interested is understanding how these numbers actually relate. So if we consider these as percentages, inherent risk, control risk, and detection risk, if we want to keep audit risk low, if one element is high, we need to mitigate this by lowering the other component. The idea is that the audit risk is the risk that the auditor is issuing an inappropriate opinion. The auditor manages this audit risk by considering these three elements: inherent risk, control risk, and detection risk. So let's talk about each of these elements and make sure that we understand what they really mean. Inherent risk is what is inherently risky about the element within the financial statement, whether it's an asset, whether it's an account balance. As an example, the inherent risk related to cash. The nature of cash is such that there is risk associated with that. The next piece of this is control risk. Control risk essentially implies what management has in place to mitigate this inherent risk. The lower the control risk, the stronger the internal controls. So part of our audit is to understand the control risk within the organization. We understand what the controls are. We are going to define the risk of material misstatement. Key word here is risk of material misstatement. And again, when we talk about risk, we're talking about something bad that could happen. Doesn't necessarily mean that it has happened. So we're looking at risk from the perspective of material misstatement, and we're looking at this from understanding the inherent risk, the nature of the organization, the nature of account balances, the nature of the specific assets and liabilities, And we're also considering it from a control risk. Control risk meaning what are the controls in place that management has implemented to mitigate the inherent risk. Through our understanding of inherent risk and control risk, we define the risk of material misstatement. The risk of material misstatement will define detection risk. Now keep in mind that detection risk is the responsibility of the auditor. The auditor manages detection risk by managing the nature of the testing, the timing of the testing, and the extent of the testing. So the idea is that if we have a high risk of material misstatement, we would, as an example, increase the actual amount of testing. Now when we talk about detection risk, we're really focusing on primarily our substantive testing. The auditor needs to consider the fact that the results of this audit have implications beyond just the actual audit. There is what we call engagement risk. An auditor's exposure to financial loss and damage can be quite substantial. There's litigation damage, there is adverse publicity, something goes wrong with the audit, or something goes wrong with the organization after you've completed the audit. Everybody's going to be pointing their fingers at the auditor. And we'll talk about this in legal liability in a couple of chapters, but keep in mind that this ultimately impacts our audit risk. We don't want to be wrong with our audit, and if we are wrong, the implications go beyond just the actual financial statement that we're auditing. Using the audit risk, what we are attempting to do is to set a planned level of audit risk such that an opinion can be issued on the financial statements. We assess the risk of material misstatement. As we talked about before, the risk of material misstatement is the inherent risk, the nature of what we're looking at, and the control risk, the risk associated with the quantity and quality of internal controls that management has put in place. Using the audit risk equation, we can do a little algebraic magic here, and what we define is that the detection risk is the audit risk divided by inherent and control risk. Auditors use this level of detection risk to design the audit, and we're designing audit procedures that will reduce audit risk to an acceptable level. And again, keep in mind that when we're talking about audit risk, we can never eliminate it, but what we're looking for is we're looking for an acceptable level of audit risk. We need to understand the relationship of the entity's business risks to the audit risk model. So as we are considering the organization, what we need to do is we need to understand the organization, we need to understand the external environment related to this organization, and make decisions related to what is inherently risky within the organization. As an example, after 2007 with the financial crisis, inherently auditors considered investments to be highly risky, and they focused additional attention on these elements as they were going through the financial statements. So we're assessing the entity's business risk levels. We are relating these risks to what can go wrong at the account balance or disclosure level, and this is a part of our assessment of the risk of material mistake. Limitations to the audit risk model is the audit risk model is a planning tool. That's all it is. There are limitations. The desired of audit risk may not ever be achieved. It does not consider the potential of audit error, and there's really no way of knowing what the preliminary level of audit risk of material misstatement actually was. So we are setting the model, and if you do a little research related to developing models, we understand that models are not always correct, but at least it gives you a starting point to understand the process. And that's really what we're trying to do, is understand what's taking place. Auditors need to identify business risks and identify and understand the potential misstatements that may result. Business risks are the results of significant conditions, events, circumstances, or action that impair management's ability to execute strategies. We gave the example of the financial crisis. There's certainly going to be others in terms of the competitive environment, new technologies, maybe significant growth within the organization, or the lack of growth. All these things are going to help the auditor understand where the risks are coming from. This is a tremendous tool, and I recommend that you go into the chapter and review this information, because this takes you through the step-by-step process in terms of understanding what is taking place within the organization as it relates to the internal controls, as it relates to the risk assessment process. You notice the first item is understanding the nature of the entity, understanding the industry and the regulatory environment. It's very possible that as you become skilled in an audit, is that you're going to not only be skilled in an audit, but you're going to specialize in a very specific industry. And the reason this occurs is because there are unique features related to each industry, unique risks that the auditor needs to understand. We need to understand the objectives of strategies and business risks. We also need to understand what the entity is doing in terms of managing this through this process of performance measures. And ultimately, we are also very interested in understanding the control environment that the organization has. So we need to identify business risk. We need to evaluate the enterprise risk assessment process and how management is responding to these business risks. And through this process is we are assessing the risk of material misstatement as it relates to the financial statement, assertions, and account balances. How do we gather evidence? We make inquiries of management, other entity personnel, and those outside the entity. So we're very interested in understanding where the industry is going. So we're going to talk to industry experts. You notice also that we're using analytical procedures. The chapter goes through a number of analytical procedures that we need to consider. Analytical procedures are simply mathematical models, days sales outstanding, debt to asset, all these ratios that we learn in various financial accounting classes. But the reason that we're doing these is we are comparing these to prior periods. We're also comparing these to industry standards. And the reason we're doing this is we're attempting to understand where there might be risks within the organization. Now, the one point that we want to make related to analytical procedures is we absolutely, as part of the internal or as part of the external audit standards, we absolutely need to complete analytical procedures at the beginning, risk assessment process of the audit. We also need to do analytical procedures at the end of the audit. We're also going to talk about analytical procedures as substantive procedures. And again, when we talk about substantive procedures, we're talking about these procedures where we are measuring monetary misstatements. So we're basically looking at analytical procedures here where it is a required step at the beginning of the audit. The other piece here is observation and inspection. As part of our risk assessment process, we need to be very attuned to what's going on in the organization. So we are going to conduct very specific interviews with many people within the organization. We're going to have inspections. We're going to do walkthroughs in maybe the manufacturing and the inventory and the purchasing departments. All of this helps us gather information as we are considering risks related to what's taking place within the organization. And again, the reason we're considering risk is this helps us become efficient within our audit because we're going to focus our attention on those areas that we consider to be high risk. So we need to understand the entity. We need to understand the entity, the nature, what it does, what the regulatory background is, what the internal controls are, what is the strategy of the organization. We need to understand this because this is going to help us develop our understanding of risk. You notice that entity performance measures, as part of an enterprise risk management process, management should be measuring their successes and failures. We need to understand how management is actually doing this. And again, why are we doing this is helps us understand the entity and its environment. Nature of the entity, the personnel structure. Maybe we need to understand, is there a high turnover? We need to understand the source of funding, investments, operational characteristics, size and complexity, the growth. Is it a high growth? Is it a low growth? Is it not growing at all? Understand key suppliers as well as customers. This just gives us an idea of some of the things that we're going to be considering. We need to understand the regulatory conditions. So if you're working in a hospital market, there's going to be significant, unique regulatory issues that really are not going to affect other types of industries. We need to understand these. So every type of industry, whether it's healthcare, banking, pharmaceutical, retail, all have very specific regulatory factors that we need to consider. We are ultimately, in this risk assessment process, assessing the risk of material misstatement. Assessing the risk of material misstatement is understanding the inherent risk and the control risk. And again, we are not saying that material misstatement is taking place. We're only trying to determine what is the risk that material misstatement may take place. Examples of material misstatements would include inaccuracy in gathering or processing data, omissions of an account or disclosure, financial statement disclosures that are not presented in accordance with GAAP, an incorrect accounting estimate, judgments made by management that the auditor considers to be unreasonable. These are just some examples of the types of things that we are looking at. Keep in mind that ultimately we're looking for material misstatements, whether due to error or fraud. Error is unintentional misstatements. Fraud represents intentional misstatements by one or more people, usually among management or those in charge with governance. And we'll talk through this course in terms of what specific fraud issues there is going to be. But at this point, we're just really looking at it from the perspective of risk. And in fact, one of the things that auditors do as they are conducting these interviews is they will explicitly ask, are you aware or do you suspect any type of fraud taking place? And the reason we're asking this is we are very concerned with fraud as it relates to the risk of material misstatement. In fact, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about fraud. The fraud assessment process, again, looking for intentional misstatements. When we talk about fraud, there's really two types of fraud that we focus on. One relates to the misappropriation of assets. This is basically where we're stealing assets, or someone is stealing assets from the organization. Could be a customer, could be employees, could even be executives. The other type of fraud is financial statement fraud. This is where senior level management officials are attempting to or actually manipulating financial statements for their own benefit. We understand this, and what we're attempting to do is identify where this fraud may take place or identify the risk of this fraud. Sources of information could be communication among the audit team, inquiries of management, analytical procedures, investigation of unexpected period end discussions. I want to focus on, as our last point, communication among the audit team. One of the things that is clearly important in terms of understanding fraud risk is as we are gaining an understanding of the process within the organization, the audit team needs to document this, but they also need to communicate among themselves, usually in some sort of formal meeting, where they are reviewing the information and basically brainstorming with the idea of determining if in fact there may be some gaps in the system where fraud could take place. At this risk assessment process, we're not saying fraud is taking place. We're just identifying where it could possibly happen or where the problem could possibly occur. So through this communication process, through this brainstorming process within the audit team, we're able to identify some very specific issues related to fraud. And again, why are we concerned with fraud? We're concerned with fraud because it has an impact on the material misstatements within the financial statements. And as we had said, is that we're determining if there are material misstatements, whether due to error or fraud. So very specific steps that we need to do in relationship to fraud. So I hope this brief video helps our understanding of the process. This should provide some very specific information as you are beginning to understand what's taking place. Again, there is a process. The process is a risk assessment. The risk assessment is where we are considering the inherent risk. We are considering the control risk. Through these two items, we are determining the risk of material misstatement. The risk of material misstatement will determine the nature, timing, and extent of our audit procedures. Primarily, these are going to be substantive procedures as we are attempting to measure monetary misstatement within the financial statements. But when we're in the risk assessment, we're not measuring material misstatements. We're only attempting to identify where the risk is associated with these misstatements. So I hope this clarifies some things. This is very important information because this is going to follow throughout this course. I thank you very much for your time, and I'm looking forward to talking to you shortly.